Dear participants, I welcome all of you in this lecture of Programming in Python, where I would discuss error handling. So, in last class, I discussed what are modules and packages, and how to create package and the package hierarchy. I discussed all these concepts. So whatever we are writing in a Python file, whether let's say I am creating a function that could be used by any other program. So that file would be treated as a module. Similarly, if I am writing a class and storing it in a Python file, so that can be treated as a module. And these module can be used by any program. I also discussed how can we set Python path file so that your module can be picked from anywhere. So that we had seen in last class. In today's class, we will discuss introduction to error. So what error means actually, and how exceptions are raised, and the background of exception that we'll discuss. Similarly, Python allows you to handle exceptions as well. Then we'll discuss certain problems on exception. So what are errors actually? So when you are writing program, let's say you are writing program in Python or Java or C or any language. So usually we used to face different type of errors. So error in Python can be distinguished in two different kinds or categories. One is syntax error and the another one is exception. So syntax error is that type of error where the program is syntactically not correct. So there is an example here. In this particular program, let me select the pen now. So in this particular program, there is no any gap between I and in. So the very first is actually the variable I, and there should be some space, and then in should be used. So it is actually syntactically it is not correct. So it gives us syntax error, which is actually invalid syntax. So each and every programming language has its own syntax. So that syntax need to be followed. So if there is a lacuna in, or you could say if you are not following the syntax, so it will give you syntax error. Now what is exception then? A program may be syntactically correct, but it may cause an error during execution. So at the time of execution, or you could say runtime, the error may come. The case may be, let's say, during runtime, there is a expression in which divide by 0 is there. Somehow you have written a programs and in Python, let's say C is B divided by A, right? And somehow A is actually coming as 0. So at that moment of time, your program would generate an exception, divide by 0 exception actually. So and the reason could be something, let's say A is actually the value that is coming from the user. User is entering this value, or A might be another expression, and that expression is actually generating 0. So there could be several reasons. Let's say you are reading a file and that file is not present. Somehow that file has been deleted. Again, input output error would be generated. That type of exception will be generated. Then let's say you are reading a list, and you are reading a list beyond its limit, right? Let's say you have declared a error as A10, list as a A10. It means it can contain 10 elements, but you are reading an element, let's say A11, A12, A13, anything. So at that moment of time, index error would be generated. So there could be several exceptions that might get generated during the execution of the program. So error detected during execution are called exceptions. So an exception is an event that disrupt the normal flow of the program instruction. So whenever exception is generated, so the program would be terminated if it is not handled, right? Let's say I'm reading an input from user. So I am expecting an integer value from user. So I'm receiving input as x int and then input and enter number. Okay. And instead of entering a number, the user has entered let's say alphabets. So what would happen in this case? So an error would be generated, and actually exception would be generated. Though so the Python will generate an exception, right? So there could be several reasons where your program could face an exception. Let me show you what are the different ways through which we can Python program can generate an exception. I'm switching to IDE. So let's say I'm declaring a variable a is equal to 10, and let's say b is equal to 0, and I'm calculating c is equal to a divided by b, right? So you can see here, so it is giving me an error that is it is actually an exception, which is zero division error. So this is the name of the exception, and it is the explanation of the exception. Similarly, there could be several other reason, right? So this is exception. And what is syntax error? So I'm writing as I in and range 10 and let's say print hello. If I'm writing this particular program, so it is giving me a syntax error. So this is the syntax error, which actually says there is the program is not following the syntax of a particular language. So at that moment of time, syntax error would be generated, right? And there could be other reason as well, where you would face an exception. Let me write one program here. I'm expecting a input from user, right? An integer value actually. So what I would write here, integer input and then enter a number, right? And then so I'm saving it. Somehow I'm saving it here, and yes, this one. Okay, and so let me run this one. So enter a number. Let's say I'm pressing 4. So everything would be right. There won't be any error. But if I am inputting a alphabet, right, A. So now you can observe here. So this is an exception value error, and this is actually the explanation of this error, this exception: invalid letter for integer with base 10, right? So I'm not providing the valid number in this case. So you could observe different type of errors. Now it is the responsibility of the programmer to handle these cases, right? Suppose there could be other reason as well, array out of bound exception. Let me create one list here. I'm creating a list and range, so range 10. So it would give me it would create a list having value, let me erase this one. So having value from 0 to 9. So A would contain values from 0 to 9. Now I'm trying to access individual values of A for I in, and then length of A, and then range. Okay, so print AI. So what do you think? Is this particular code is fine or it would generate an exception. Just think on it. So this code is actually perfectly fine. So there won't be any exception. Let me execute this one. And you are getting these values, right? Now I'm modifying this code and writing range 20. So what would happen? Since A is having only 10 values, starting from index would be from 0 to 9, right? Now this particular loop is accessing value beyond index 9, right? So at that moment of time, an exception would be generated. Let me execute this one. So here you can see it has printed till 9, but beyond 9th index, it has given, it has generated this particular error, that is index error. And what is the index error? Which is actually list index out of range. So this is again an exception. So we have seen three different types of exception: index error, divide by 0 exception, divide by 0 error, then value error. So these are exceptions. Let me come to the PPT now. So you have seen an exception is an event that disturbs the normal flow of the program instruction. So it is actually somehow disturbing the normal flow, and the program would be terminated. When a Python script encounters a situation that it cannot handle, it raises an exception. So we have seen there are different types of exception that has been generated here. So how we will define exception? So an exception is a Python object that represents an error. There is actually error somehow because of different conditions. Program has generated certain exception. When a Python script raises an exception, it must be handled immediately. Otherwise, it would terminate and come out. So if your program, like we have seen, if there is as an exception, so program would be terminated until unless you write code to handle those exceptions, right? If you are having exceptional handler in your code, then you can take certain decision whether you want to repeat it, or you want to exit from this program, or you want to read inside a loop, so that you can decide. But if you are not handling the exception, so there is no such option. Program would be abruptly terminated. Here is an example again that I have already tried to show you. I have created a list here having values from 0 to 9, and I'm trying to find which number is odd, and I am trying to find the count of even numbers and odd numbers. But you can observe here the range is 20, so the value would range from 0 to 19, right? And beyond 19, it would give me error, that is index error, that is actually exception. So after ninth index, the program would be abruptly terminated, and your program would generate index error as an exception. Now this can be handled. So I am handling this exception using this try and except block. So try block is the block that actually contains the code that might generate an error, that might generate an exception. So my code, this particular code can generate error, and particularly this may generate an exception, right? So I have included this code inside this try, okay, and I have handled that exception using this particular construct, that is except. What is except, that I will discuss. Now I would print here index out of range, and then finally I break from this loop, and econt and even number of cont and odd number of numbers cont would be displayed. So here I am displaying my own message. Instead of abruptly terminating, I am displaying my own message here. So how to handle exception? So we have seen what is syntax error and what is exception, and now we are moving towards how to handle an exception. So if a code may raise an exception, better to use a try block to defend. It means if you know that this particular code may generate an exception, so better to uh, mm, uh, write a try block, and that try block would actually contain the code that may generate the exception, and after the try block include an except statement. So after except statement, like in this case, so this code may generate an exception, and here except is a construct, and this one is the type of exception, right? Like value error exception, index error, and divide by 0, and so on. So there could be different type of exception. So I would write here all these exception. So my code may generate these much of exceptions. So I would include all these exception, or you could do one thing. If you are you may exclude the type of exceptions, right? Just write except, that's it. So this would handle all type of exceptions, but this is not ideal way to write but this is not ideal way to handle exception, because if you are not if you are not including the exception type, so what would happen during the exceptional handler, you would not be able to decide which type of error actually which code has generated the error, or which type of error actually my code is generating, which type of exception my code is generating. So you would not be able to find out. So better to use except with type of exception, and there is one clause that is else. So if there is no any exception, then this block would be executed. So if your code is perfectly fine and it has not generated any exception, so else block would be executed. So this is the way actually exceptions are handled. Like in this case, here is an example. So I'm trying to open a file to read certain content, right? And since this file is not available, right? So it would give me an error, input output error. Okay, so this would give me an error, that is input output error. So this is actually exception. So this exception would be generated. Okay. Similarly, since we have seen you can include different exception with except clause, other ways to use several exception inside except as a parameter actually. So let's say I am writing except index error. This is one type of exception. Input output error. So this is another type of exception, and so on. So I can include all these here in except, and else would be there. There could be cases when except with no exception can be used to catch all type of exception. So I have already discussed. You can exclude the exception type of exception here, so that would catch all type of exception. So using this kind of try except statement is not considered a good programming practice, because it catches all exceptions but does not make the programmer identify the root cause of the problem that may occur, right? So this is not a good programming practice. Better to include exceptions, type of exception with the except clause. But anyhow, you can use except without type of exception. So it would run, and there won't be any syntax error or runtime error, or you could say exception. But this is not the ideal way of programming. So better to include type of exception as well with except. There is one more construct, that is finally. So you can use finally block along with your try block. So the finally block is a place to put any code that must execute, whether the try block raised an exception or not. So finally block would always be executed whether there is exception or not. Like I have discussed, if you are having else, so I can include else block as well. So else blocks would only be executed when there is no any exception, right? But finally block would be executed irrespective of raising exception. So whether it is whether exception is being raised or not, so finally block would be executed. So it is very important in scenario where you are opening a file, right? And you want to close that file, whether your program has generated exception or not. So in any case, you want to close the file, right? So we can include that type of a statement inside the finally block. Like in this case, there is an example here. So what I'm trying to do, suppose I'm trying to open a file for write purpose or read purpose. Actually, let me use read purpose. So if this file is not available, right? So what would happen? It would generate an exception, and after the generating exception, the control would come to the finally block, and this would be closed, right? Suppose, let's say it is for write purpose. So there is no such exception in this case, and it would try to write content into this file. So everything is okay. Still, it would come to this block and it would try to close the file. So your finally block would always be executed. So finally, we can have, I'm clubbing all those construct of exception. So try block, when we used where we used to include try block. So this block will test the expected error to occur. So where we will include try, we will add this try block where our code may generate an exception. And what about except? So here you actually handle the error, except, and then you would have type of exception. And what about else? Else is if there are no exception, then this block will be executed. And what about finally? So finally block always gets executed, either exception is generated or not. So there is a difference between else and finally, right? So this is the syntax of how to handle exception. We are having try, except, else, finally, right? So let me write certain code related to exception. I am switching to IDLE here. I was discussing a case. Let's say I'm taking input from user, and I'm expecting an integer value from the user. I'm mentioning here enter a number, right? Enter a number. Okay. So if user would enter in integer, then it is perfectly fine, right? But if user is entering alphabet, then in that case an exception will be generated. Let me run this one. So input, sorry, not enter input. This is not enter input, and I'm executing this one. So let's say I'm entering value 2. So it is perfectly fine. Now, if I would enter alphabets, then it would give me an exception. So what I am trying to update this code. So until unless user enter the input, enter the numeric value, so we would ask user to input the data. Let's say user has entered alphabet, then I would display a message that your data is invalid, please retry, please input integer value only. So how we could write this type of program? So since this particular program may generate an exception, right? So what we need to do? We need to write try block, right? So this code should be inside the try block, right? And then in case of exception, so except and print. So what I will write here, invalid data, only integer values are expected, right? So I can give this particular message to user. Let me execute this one. If I'm pressing A, so it has given me this answer. So instead of generating this particular error or exception, now I'm handling that exception. Now what I'm trying to do, I would read this particular block inside the while loop, and the purpose is I will ask user to retry, right? Suppose he or she has entered wrong data. Instead of integer, he or she has entered alphabet. So I would ask them to retry. Okay, so while true, and I would make this code inside the while loop. Sorry, this should be inside the try block, and then, and what exception is generating here? Actually, value error, right? Value error is actually the type of exception here. Now, invalid data, enter integer only, retry, and enter integer only, right? So it would be executed, right? And in case of, I'm also including else condition here. So I have already told you what the purpose of else would be executed when there is no any exception, right? So I will break here from the loop. Okay, so let me execute this one. So this loop would be executed. So let's say I'm entering A. So invalid data, retry and enter integer only. Let's say I'm again entered alphabet. So it would again display this message. So until unless I enter integer, so this message would be displayed again and again. So now I'm entering 3. So now it is perfectly fine. There is no any exception, and my else block has executed, and it has come out from the while loop. So it has come out from the while loop because of break. So in this way you can handle exceptions, right? Let me try one more example here. I'm trying to find I'm trying to read a file here. let's say f is equal to open and abc.txt and read mode. I am trying to read data from a particular file, and it may generate input output error. So it may generate this particular data. So file is not available. File is not available. All right. So let me execute this one. Sorry. Oh, it has gone in infinite loop. Why? Because this statement has been close the program. I'm closing this program because I had included a block here, while loop. Let me again open this one. So, and let me open that file. Okay. Sorry, this was not the file. Yes. So what was the issue? Since I had used while loop, so that's why it has given me this particular infinite print, that is file not available. Right. So I'm excluding this one while loop and make it this one try here and then except so else and then break. Now it would work fine. This one break. So right. So what I'm trying to find break outside loop. Oh, sorry. There won't be any break because I have excluded the loop. So now I'm running this particular code. So file is not available. It has given me this message. If I want handle this exception, then input output error type of exception would be generated by the Python itself, right? So in this way you can handle this different type of exceptions, and you can even include try final block as well. So there are the Python provides a very innovative way to handle exceptions. So except if you are handling exceptions, it means you can decide, you can take certain decision that what should be done in case of this type of exception. Let's say if you are generating, if you are getting value error, then you can again take input from the user, like we have seen in the previous example. Let me come to the PPT now. So I have included here one. Let me select the pen. So I have included here an example code. So it is taking certain input from the user, and as well as it is trying to write certain text into this file. Okay, and also it is trying to some values. It is trying to find the sum of values from 0 to n. Not 0 to n, actually it would generate value from 0 to n minus 1. So it would generate this particular numbers, and here the sum would be sum is this particular variable sum is used to sum these numbers, that is between 0 to n, not n minus 1, it is actually n. So 0 to n. Now if user is not inputting integer number, then what would happen? This particular error would be generated, and it will say it will display a message, invalid entry, please retry, right? So since this code is inside the while loop, So again it would come to this try block, and let's say it has entered the right number. So since it has entered the right number, then this file will be uh, open in write mode, and if file does not exist in since it is being opened in write mode, so this file would be created, right? So there won't be any input output error. And finally, uh, at last, else block would be executed, right? Else block, when there is no any exception, then else block would be executed, and it would break from this while loop, right? So if it is breaking from this while loop, then this particular final block would not be executed, because I have written here break, right? This finally block would be executed when there is some exception in this case, right? Because if there is no any exception, then this block would be executed, and it would terminate the loop because of break, right? So in this way you can write try and catch block according to your according to your problem that is in your hand. So I'm summarizing what I discussed in today's class. So we discussed on what is error, and we have seen how exception are different from syntax error, and what are the different categories of error, and we have seen what are the different types of exception as well, and how to handle exceptions, and we seen certain problems on exception. So thank you so much for joining this class. I will discuss some other topic in next class.